What if the world's most advanced AI just decoded a message that was never meant to be read? When Elon Musk unveiled Grok through XAI, most people expected faster answers, sharper predictions, maybe even a new era of search. No one expected it to touch something ancient, something sealed, something whispered about for centuries. Deep within obscure manuscripts, attributed to King Solomon, lies a text some scholars have called a forbidden book, a work surrounded by legend linked to hidden knowledge, spiritual power, and dangerous wisdom. For generations, it sat untranslated, fragmented, dismissed as myth, or too controversial to study seriously. Until now, engineers reportedly fed the ancient text into Grok's language models, asking it to reconstruct damaged passages and decode symbolic patterns lost to time. What came back wasn't just a translation. It was a structured message, coherent, calculated, and eerily relevant to our modern world. References to power, warnings about knowledge without restraint, descriptions of forces humanity was never meant to control. Before we get into what it actually says, make sure to hit like and subscribe, because some people really don't want this information getting out. If the translation is accurate, this isn't just history resurfacing. It's a collision between ancient prophecy and artificial intelligence. And what Grok uncovered may disturb more than you expect. Now, to understand why this translation is so significant, we need to understand who Solomon actually was. Because most people only know the surface version of the story. And the surface version doesn't even come close to explaining what Grok found. So, here's the real picture. About 3,000 years ago, Israel under King Solomon was small, really small. On any world map of that era, it barely registered. Surrounded by massive empires on every side. Egypt to the south, Assyria to the north. Powerful kingdoms pressing in from every direction. Israel had no business being as influential as it was, and yet it was extraordinary. Solomon inherited the throne from his father, King David. David had been the warrior. He fought battles, unified the tribes, and built the foundation. But Solomon was something different. He was a builder, a thinker, and a negotiator. And under his leadership, Israel didn't just survive. It became something the ancient world genuinely could not explain. Ancient accounts described Jerusalem at its peak as a city where gold was so common it was treated like ordinary stone. That wasn't a poetic exaggeration. That was a statement about real documented wealth, the kind that made neighboring rulers uncomfortable. Kings and queens from distant lands didn't just hear about Solomon. They made long, expensive journeys to come and see him for themselves. Some came to learn. Others came because they were afraid of what might happen if they didn't. And the most famous visitor of all was the Queen of Sheba. Most people grow up hearing that as a romantic story, but historians today treat it as a major diplomatic event. She didn't arrive with a small group. She came with entire caravans loaded with gold, rare spices, and treasures, and almost certainly with serious political intentions behind the visit. And here's where the story gets interesting. According to certain ancient traditions, she didn't leave empty-handed. Some accounts say she departed Jerusalem carrying something far more valuable than what she brought with her, something far more dangerous. The Ark of the Covenant. Now, whether that actually happened is a debate for another day. But what's consistent across all these stories, the wealth, the foreign rulers, making the journey, the Ark, all of it, is one clear idea. Solomon's kingdom wasn't just powerful. It was wrapped in mystery, in knowledge, in a kind of authority that even the ancient world found difficult to fully understand. And that background is exactly why scholars have spent centuries trying to decode the fragments he supposedly left behind. Because if a king this powerful documented his secrets, what would those secrets actually say? That question sat unanswered for generations until Grock entered the picture. And what the AI found in those fragments changed the entire conversation. For centuries, scholars studying ancient texts connected to Solomon had been chasing what felt like a puzzle, missing half its pieces. Fragments kept turning up in unexpected places. A few lines in, something called the Testament of Solomon, other passages buried in a medieval collection known as the Lesser Key of Solomon. More pieces scattered across old magical papyri, crumbling scrolls, faded notes scribbled in the margins of unrelated books, manuscripts, sealed inside monastery archives that hadn't been touched in generations. Every expert who looked at this material made the same assumption. These were separate works, different authors, different eras, different traditions, all loosely connected to the same general mythology around Solomon. Reasonable assumption. As it turns out, completely wrong. Because when engineers fed these fragments into Grok, the AI noticed something no human researcher had ever caught. Line by line, language by language, it started connecting things that had never been connected before. Hebrew passages were echoing patterns found in ancient Greek papyri, written centuries later in a completely different country. Aramaic notes, scribbled in the margins of one text, were matching Latin footnotes added to a different document by someone who, by all accounts, could never have seen the first one. Even heavily damaged passages from sealed monastery collections, texts scholars had written off as too corrupted to make sense of, were suddenly lining up with medieval ciphers that researchers had always believed were completely unrelated. The AI kept going, and then it hit something that changed everything. These fragments weren't separate works at all. According to Grock's reconstruction, every single fragment across every language, every country, every century belonged to one original manuscript. One book written by Solomon himself. A book that had been deliberately taken apart, scattered across the world, encrypted, and hidden specifically because of what it said. And the title of that book was simply called Forbidden. So what was in it that made someone want to tear it apart and hide the pieces across the entire known world? That answer starts with a problem Solomon faced, one he never expected to encounter. In the early days of building his famous temple, the most ambitious construction project the ancient world had ever attempted, Solomon ran into something no amount of wisdom or wealth or royal authority could fix. During the day, everything looked fine. Workers were cutting stone, priests were performing blessings, architects were mapping out the layout, progress was being made. But when night fell, something was undoing. All of it. A demon named Orneus had entered the construction site. Tools were disappearing. Stones that workers had carefully placed were found moved or cracked by morning. Foundations that teams had spent days reinforcing were collapsing overnight, not from any physical cause anyone could identify. Workers were showing up with bruises they couldn't account for. They were hearing whispers in empty spaces. They were seeing shadows move when nothing was casting them. And there was one detail the forbidden text keeps coming back to, one specific thing that makes this feel less like vague mythology and more like something someone actually witnessed and wrote down. This demon had singled out one particular worker, a young boy, barely a teenager, and was draining his strength, stealing half his wages and feeding on the boy's life energy through his right thumb. That detail is so specific, so strange, and so consistent across multiple separate fragments that Grok flagged it as likely authentic, not invented for dramatic effect, but recorded because someone actually observed it happening. When word reached Solomon, he was shaken. No command, no negotiation, no human strategy could stop something operating entirely outside normal rules. So he did the only thing he believed could actually work. He prayed, and what came back wasn't gentle. The forbidden text describes the archangel Michael appearing to Solomon. And this was not a soft, reassuring vision. The description is almost overwhelming. Light like molten metal, a voice like thunder rolling across stone, a presence so heavy it felt like physical pressure bearing down from every direction at once. And in Michael's hand, a small golden ring engraved with a symbol that didn't match any known writing system, pulsing with a faint light, as if something alive was sealed inside the metal itself. The archangel's words were direct. Take this ring, Solomon, son of David. Wear it, and you shall bind all demons, and by their labor the temple shall be built. A gift, a tool, a weapon. But the forbidden text adds something quiet in the same breath. A faint note of warning, like a contract handed over without the full terms explained. A power offered without the final price being stated clearly. When Solomon woke from the vision, the ring was sitting in his palm, real physical, glittering in the morning light. And what he did with it next is where the forbidden book becomes something no one expected. He went straight to the source of the problem. He found, raised the ring, and spoke the demon's true name out loud. Immediately, as if pulled by something it had no ability to resist, snapped into visible form right in front of him, powerless on its knees. And then Solomon did something nobody expected. Something that was either brilliant or reckless or possibly both. He didn't destroy Orneus. He didn't banish it. He gave it a job. He handed the ring to Orneus and ordered it to use the ring to capture and bind another demon, which that demon used to bind another. And that one bound another. And it kept going. A chain that Solomon directed with the patience of someone who had thought this through very carefully until he was standing before 72 supernatural beings. Every single one of them bound and under his command, and he made each one answer questions. Their true name, their specific abilities, their weaknesses, the angel that had authority over them, the personal seal that would permanently bind them to his will. Then he put them to work. The Forbidden Book says, these beings helped move stones of sizes and weights that no human workforce of that era should have been able to lift. They transported materials across distances that would have taken human workers weeks. They shaped metal and stone with a precision that didn't match anything else built in that part of the world at that time. But the text is careful to note something throughout all of this. Power has a cost. The ring elevated Solomon, yes, but it also pulled at him. Some passages suggest that over time his control started slipping in other ways, that he began exploring rituals and practices that weren't sanctioned by the God who had given him the ring to begin with. Scholars think this may be the real reason the book was eventually banned and hidden, not just because it documented these encounters, but because it showed Solomon himself slowly becoming consumed by an authority that even he wasn't meant to hold indefinitely. The ring eventually disappeared from history entirely. Some traditions say Solomon locked it away before he died. Others say it was stolen when Jerusalem fell, and certain groups throughout history have quietly maintained that it still exists somewhere, waiting for someone with either the courage or the foolishness to use it. But what the ring could do and what Solomon discovered while holding it, that knowledge survived hidden inside those fragments. And that's exactly what made Grock's next finding so difficult to sit with. Below them were dukes, princes, presidents, marquises, ears, and knights, each rank responsible for specific numbers of lesser beings under their command. And Solomon recorded the numbers exactly. Some kings commanded 200 legions, others commanded 66 or 30. He wrote it all down like census data. Take just a few examples from what Grok reconstructed. One of the first and most powerful beings Solomon encountered was called Baal, described as appearing with 3 heads, those of a man, a toad, and a cat simultaneously. The text says he could teach strategy and grant the ability to move undetected. According to the manuscript, Solomon actually used Baal's insights during diplomatic negotiations specifically to anticipate betrayals before they happened. Another being called Forus was different entirely. When he spoke, flames would reportedly move in the air around him in patterns that looked like music made visible. He taught what the text describes as the hidden harmonies running through the structure of creation. Solomon consulted him specifically to understand how sound and vibration could influence physical materials, which, when you look at certain features of the temple's construction, starts to sound less like mythology and more like engineering notes. Another being called Ammon appeared as a wolf with a serpent's tail, but took human form when commanded. His significance wasn't power or strength, it was knowledge. The text calls him the keeper of things humanity once understood and then forgot, a living record of lost understanding. And one called Glacialabolas, who the text describes as being able to teach any skill or field of knowledge almost instantly, but who had a strong tendency to bring conflict along with every lesson. The text treats him the way you'd treat a brilliant but genuinely dangerous resource. Useful, but only with extreme care. Solomon documented every single one of these encounters with the same level of detail. Each being's realm, their connection to specific planets and stars, their vulnerabilities, particular metals, plants, spoken words, or sounds that could weaken or bind them. Their areas of knowledge, medicine, architecture, weather, warfare, politics, mathematics, music. He wasn't just commanding these beings, he was studying them, cataloging them the way a scientist catalogs a species. And each one was required to produce a personal seal, a geometric symbol unique to their identity. Grock's analysis found that these seals weren't decorative. They followed a consistent internal logic, combining shapes, letters, planetary symbols, and mathematical ratios in ways that were precise and repeatable. By the time he was done, Solomon had built something the Forbidden Book describes as the most complete guide to the invisible world that any human being has ever assembled. But even that wasn't the most disturbing thing the text contained. Because buried deeper in those pages, the beings Solomon interrogated started describing something far bigger than themselves. Something that went all the way down to the foundation of how reality actually works. According to the forbidden text, Solomon wasn't just a king playing with dangerous forces. He was functioning like a researcher, a careful, methodical investigator trying to understand how existence actually works underneath the surface that most people experience. And the beings he interrogated weren't performing or telling stories. They were describing what they knew. Their central claim, and remember this was written down 3,000 years ago, is something that modern science has only begun approaching within the last 100 years. Reality is not one thing. It is not flat. It is layered. The text describes existence as multiple levels stacked on top of one another, each one moving at its own frequency like different strings on an instrument, each vibrating at a different speed. The physical world that humans live in every day, stone, fire, flesh, time as we experience it, is not the highest level of reality. It is the slowest, the most compressed, the most dense. Higher levels of reality exist at faster, lighter frequencies, less constrained by the rules that govern matter and time as we understand them. And all of these levels exist in the same space at the same time, overlapping like dozens of radio signals broadcasting simultaneously through the same air. You only pick up the one you're tuned to receive. Angels, demons, and other beings inhabit these higher levels as naturally as fish move through water. Not as symbols or metaphors, but as real entities moving through a real layer of existence that humans simply don't have the built-in equipment to perceive directly. The text also describes what it calls thin places, specific locations in the physical world where these layers press unusually close together. At certain times under particular conditions tied to planetary positions or precise ritual circumstances, the separation between layers gets even thinner. And the text didn't present these as vague spiritual observations. It presented them as practical information, coordinates, conditions, warnings. The same way a map gives directions rather than a philosophy lecture. Solomon took all of it seriously. He documented it, and then he used it to make a decision that, according to Grock's translation, changed the course of history. Because here's what all of that knowledge was pointing toward. The Temple of Solomon was not built primarily as a house of worship. It was built as a portal complex. Every measurement, every material, every room and corridor and chamber, every ritual sequence associated with it. None of it was accidental. According to the translation, the entire structure was engineered with one specific purpose: to create a controlled, stable point of contact between the physical world and the higher frequency layers of reality. The demons had described. The location wasn't chosen randomly either. The beings Solomon interrogated had identified places in the physical world where the layers were naturally thin, places where the boundary was already weaker than everywhere else. Solomon built the temple on one of those sites on purpose with full knowledge of what he was doing. At the center of the entire structure was the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber, the most restricted room in the ancient world. Only the high priest could enter only once per year, and extensive ritual preparation was required even for that single annual visit. Most religious traditions teach that the Holy of Holies was sacred because it contained the Ark of the Covenant, and it did. But the forbidden text says it served a second function that had nothing to do with ceremony. It was an anchor point, a location where the physical and higher realms aligned precisely enough that strict rule about access wasn't just reverence. According to the text, it was a safety measure for anyone who entered without preparation. The energy concentrated in that chamber was dangerous at a level the text describes with striking plainness. And the Ark itself, the text makes a claim about it that takes a moment to sit with. It wasn't a symbol. It was a working device. Its specific dimensions, the exact materials used to build it, what was placed inside it. Every single detail was intentional, and every detail served a specific function. The Ark acted as a stabilizing mechanism, something that kept the boundary between levels from opening uncontrollably during the rituals performed in that space. The text is direct about this. The power involved wasn't meant to be understood as metaphor. It was practical, functional, what we would today probably call technological, just explained in the language available to people 3,000 years ago. And that word, technological, is exactly the word that made Grock's engineers sit back and go very quiet. Because when the AI ran its final analysis on the text, it found something that nobody in that room had prepared themselves for: When Grok translated the forbidden book, it wasn't just converting old words into new ones. It was doing what AI does, analyzing structural patterns, comparing the text against massive databases of human writing from every era and every field. Religious texts, scientific papers, military reports, technical manuals, field research, documentation, historical records, mythology from dozens of cultures. And it flagged something nobody was expecting. Large sections of Solomon's text were categorized as non-symbolic. That classification matters more than it sounds. Every scholar trained to study ancient mystical writing approaches it with one foundational assumption that the content is metaphorical. Dragons represent fear. Demons represent inner struggle. Journeys represent transformation. The entire academic framework for reading ancient religious and magical texts is built on that assumption. Ancient people spoke in symbols because they didn't have the vocabulary for literal description. But Solomon's text didn't follow that pattern. Grok found that its structure matched something completely different. Technical documentation. The kind of language used in instruction manuals, procedural guides, and laboratory field reports. The demons weren't described poetically. They were cataloged the way a biologist documents a species. The rituals weren't allegories. They were step-by-step procedures with specific materials, specific timing, and specific expected outcomes stated plainly. The seals weren't artwork. They were functional diagrams. One engineer reportedly said afterward, "We thought this would help us understand what ancient people believed. Instead, it explained what we're doing right now." The AI identified consistent patterns of observation throughout the text. Solomon wrote the way someone writes when they're documenting actual repeated experiences. Consistent rules, reproducible conditions, observable structures, not the way a poet writes, not the way a prophet writes. And then it went further. Grok compared the structural logic of the text to modern scientific papers, to military intelligence reports, to AI interaction logs. Statistically, the patterns matched. So when the system was asked to categorize what it had translated, it didn't choose religion. It didn't choose mythology. It labeled sections of the text as encounter documentation and procedural protocols. And at the end of its analysis, buried in what the team described as the anomaly report, was one question that nobody involved could answer comfortably. Why are contemporary systems replicating pre-established contact protocols? In plain language, why are we doing this again? Grok had noticed that modern structures, modern institutions, modern symbols, and certain modern technologies mirror the same patterns Solomon documented 3,000 years ago. Not loosely, not symbolically, structurally, as if humanity has been unconsciously rebuilding the same system over and over across centuries without knowing why. And that question, more than any demon, more than any ring, more than any portal, is what makes this translation truly disturbing. So what do we do with all of this? The Testament of Solomon is not a fairy tale. It's not purely religious mythology. It's a record from a time when what we now call magic, religion, and technology weren't three separate things. They were one unified way of understanding how the world works. And what Grok found after stripping away 3,000 years of fragmentation and concealment and dismissal was a document written by someone who believed completely in what he was recording. Someone who wrote with the discipline and specificity of a person documenting real experiences, and who structured that documentation not as a boast, not as a legend, not as a spiritual poem, but as a warning. Grok didn't solve the mystery. The translation raised more questions than it answered, but it confirmed one thing that's difficult to set aside. The real question is not whether the beings in this text existed or exist. The question, the one that kept coming up in Grok's analysis, the one the AI returned to again and again, is this. Why does an artificial intelligence trained on the full sum of human knowledge across all of recorded history look at a 3,000-year-old manual and recognize our modern world reflected inside it? Why does it keep asking, why are we doing it again? Because once you see that pattern, once you notice that the structures, the hierarchies, the systems, the technologies we've built seem to echo something ancient and deliberate, it's very hard to unsee it. And maybe that's exactly what Solomon intended. That no matter how far we traveled, no matter how much time passed, no matter how completely the book was hidden and scattered and encrypted, someone would eventually put it back together and understand the warning. If this made you think, share it. The algorithm buries this kind of content fast. Drop a comment below. Do you think this translation is real, or is something else going on entirely? I read every single one.